Anyway, Colin Mackenzie is sitting in the digital green room, who is, well, frankly, I mean, if you haven't
been
Colin
dying
Mackenzie,
to get this guy on the show.
if an individual has spoken to Colin Mackenzie, then frankly, they're not worth knowing. Colin, good afternoon to you, sir. Thank you. We are not worthy. Thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much. I'm just
Colin,
laughing.
Colin, you have now made the triple, as we say in horse racing, because we've had both your daughters on the show. One daughter to go. We've got one daughter to try and get, the interior designer. We've got to get her. But we've had both your other daughters who were fantastic, and you with your book. And thank you so much, because you and I have been sort of communicating, and it's just been an absolute pleasure. Welcome to Men's Radio Station with
thank you very much for having me.
Oh, absolutely not. Right, I got to go straight in, because I months ago did a little teaser. He's gone again to get something to eat. I'm going to kill him, I swear to God. I'm going to say two words: Led Zeppelin.
Yes. I hope you didn't get the wrong idea about my Led Zeppelin connection.
I got the idea that you went on tour with Led Zeppelin. I mean, this is
I went on one major gig with them, which is featured in the book, when they flew from Newark Airport to Pittsburgh to the Three Rivers Baseball Stadium for an enormous gig in front of 40 to 45,000 people. And I saw how they lived on their aircraft. I saw how they performed. I was actually on stage with them for 3.5 hours. And at that point in my life, I actually didn't know their music at all. And after 3.5 hours of being exposed to their music with only one gap while the dear old drummer, John Bonham, played for about 20 minutes solo.
Moby Dick.
My ears were assaulted with this extraordinary sound from about 100-foot high speakers. And the crowd loved it. I can't say I did love it, although I've grown to like their music a bit more since.
Now, what I said to your daughters was, and it cracked me up, there's Led Zeppelin at the height of their Zeppness, looking like the rock gods that they were. And there's this chap in a perfect suit and tie, and you think, is this the accountant? Who is this guy? And it was you.
I'd come straight from the office in New York. I was one of 4 New York correspondents of the Daily Express at the time, and we'd been invited to go on this gig by Led Zeppelin's manager, Peter Grant, who was an enormous, interesting character, and to do a big double-page spread on them in the middle of what was then the broadsheet Daily Express. And I thought this story was dead and buried, but my beautiful daughters managed to find a film which I appeared on and had some stuff of me in my pale grey suit and tie arriving from our New York office and going on the plane with Robert Plant and all the rest of them, and apparently propping up the bar in the plane while they were all doing nefarious activities in the various bedrooms and jacuzzis on this plane. It was quite extraordinary.
Was it? I've got to ask. This has got nothing to do with mental health. I'm just blooming nosy, to be honest with you, because I've never met anybody. I saw Zepp 2 or 3 times when I was at school. We bunked off, went to see them. They were fantastic, and deafening as well. Being on the plane, I know you won't go into details because it's a family show, but was it every bit as debauched as I hope it would be?
I mean, I had to use my imagination to some extent. I wasn't present while everything was going on. I was just aware it was all going on. And I was actually just chatting to Peter Grant, trying to get the background to the group and what was going to happen. And I mean, one of the extraordinary things I witnessed was he wouldn't let the group go on stage in the Three Rivers Baseball Stadium till he counted the takings in advance. Oh, yeah. So he actually literally sat there counting hundreds of thousands of dollars before he'd let them go on stage. And that was riveting to me. It was something I've never seen before. And of course, there was a follow-up story, which you probably know all about. When they got back to New York and checked into their hotel, which I think was the Drake Hotel, the desk clerk put all this cash into the hotel safe. And Grant thought this was okay. And this wasn't just the cash from the Three Rivers Baseball Stadium. I think it was cash from 2 or 3 other gigs they'd done. And in the space of 24 hours, the hotel clerk decided this was enough to change his lifestyle, stole the lot and disappeared into the ether. And of course, this was a wonderful follow-up story for me, working on the Express at the time, as I was.
Oh my God!
You didn't know that story?
I didn't know that.
Yes.
Chuck Berry, by the way, Colin, was exactly the same. Chuck Berry would not play one note until it was paid in cash.
Is that right?
In cash. Yeah. And once he had it, he'd go on stage. Otherwise, it was no show. Now, the other person, which absolutely fascinates me that you were on the trail of, was none other than the great train robber, Ronnie Biggs.
Yes, well, this was, as in most things in life, it was a pure piece of luck that I happened to, my dad lived in Brazil, but that didn't result in me finding out about Ronnie Biggs. But he came home on leave at the end of 1973, and prior to Christmas, and I gave a little party for my neighbors to meet him. And one of them turned out to be this young student, Constantine Benkendorf, whose mother lived 5 or 6 doors down the road in Battersea, where we lived. And he came along and came into the party. And as soon as he discovered I was a journalist, he said, "Oh, I bumped into somebody you'd love to meet." Before he could even finish the sentence, I said, "You met Ronnie Biggs in Rio, didn't you?" And he went absolutely crimson. And you know when you've just hit the nail on the head. I said, "Conti, we'll go and have a pint tomorrow in the pub. Don't talk about it now. Just enjoy the party." And the following day, I met him in the local pub. And I said, "I was right, wasn't I?" He said, "How on earth did you know that?" And I said, "Well, there's only 2 or 3 really great stories going the rounds at the moment. One is to try and find out if Howard Hughes is still alive. Another one is to find where Ronnie Biggs is living 10 years after he escaped from Wandsworth Prison." And I took a chance that it was Mr. Biggs that drew your attention in Rio. He said, "You're absolutely right." I couldn't believe it. Anyway, there we are. I followed it up from then on.
And am I going completely mad, or did you fly back with Ronnie Biggs on a plane? Or am I going?
No. You're conflicting 2 stories. I ended up falling out with the editor of the Daily Express big time because he put Scotland Yard onto me. Slipper of the Yard, do you recall that?
Oh,
gentleman?
yes, Slipper of the Yard. Jack
Slipper
of the Yard
Slipper? Came out with a Sergeant Peter Jones on my tail, and I was supposed to have 2 weeks with Biggs before I handed him over to the British consulate in Rio de Janeiro, at which point he would decide to come back and complete his sentence. Now, what had happened in the interim, the 10 years where he'd been on the run, was that a parole system had come in. So instead of having to face 20 of his 30-year sentence, he could face only a third of the sentence. He'd already done 1.5 years in Wandsworth jail, so he figured he'd be on for about 8.5 years if he gave himself up. And that was the deal I'd made with him. Unfortunately, my editor, Ian McCall, decided to invoke a little insurance. He'd had a very bad experience 3 or 4 months earlier when the Daily Express claimed to have found Martin Bormann in Buenos Aires. That story turned out to be a complete farrago of lies, and the poor chap we'd photographed crossing the street in Buenos Aires, announcing it was Bormann, turned out to be an innocent Buenos Aires school teacher. We had libel actions coming from 5 or 6 different companies we'd said Bormann was a director of, and not to mention the school teacher, who I think copped about 150 grand in 1973 money. So Ian McCall was very, very nervous when I waltzed into his office 3 months later and said I thought I'd found Ronnie Biggs in Brazil. All he could see was pound signs pouring over the horizon and over the South Atlantic again. So, unbeknownst to me, he invoked some insurance in the form of Scotland Yard, and he'd been to some social event, a boxing event, I believe, sat next to the Chief Commissioner of Metropolitan Police and said, "Would you be interested in knowing that a young reporter of mine says he's found Ronnie Biggs in Brazil?" And of course, no self-respecting Commissioner of Police is going to turn down this information. And it went from bad to worse, which I can explain if you'd like.
Well, what I was going to suggest is, as much as we want to hear obviously about Ronnie Biggs, what I really want to hear personally is obviously from the men's radio station perspective. We're obviously all about mental health and well-being and things like that on this station. And one thing that's always fascinated me, if you look at some of the how can I put it? It seems to be those who are sort of not necessarily the mainstream journalists who have spoken to the big names, who talk about the pressure they're under and how it gets the better of them. But I can't help but wonder that those who get the really big scoops have to be made of pretty tough stuff. And I just wonder whether or not, have you ever sort of had a chance to think or analyze about your mental health and well-being over the years that you've been in journalism, and whether or not it's ever got the better of you once in a while? Because you don't appear to have had that happen.
Well, the Mackenzies are made of tough stuff. We originated in Scotland, and like many of the journalistic profession, I don't sound Scottish, but we were all made of tough stuff. I don't think mental health was a particular factor in the 60s and 70s. It's come much more to the fore more recently. I'm still trying to digest the notion that Queen Victoria was having menstrual pains in her 80s, but that's your previous guest was telling me that, and that's something to worry
Ollie,
about
yes,
too.
yes.
I suffered an enormous amount of pressure because I was perceived by the rest of Fleet Street as having done the unforgivable, which was to tell the police where Biggs was in the middle of a story. And when the rest of Fleet Street descended on Rio with 3 or 4 reporters from each paper, and I was still on my own with my dear photographer, Bill Lovelace, life got tough and very difficult. And there were several books. Half the Amazon rainforest was cut down with books about the shenanigans that went on that story. And that induced a lot of pressure. And of course, in the end, I resigned from the Express not in high dudgeon, as a matter of principle, because I felt so let down, and I felt I'd let Biggs down. But in the meantime, I had got him a good lawyer. I had discovered that his girlfriend was pregnant, and this was the excuse that he was allowed to remain in Brazil from when I did the story in 1974, and he only gave himself up to come back to Britain in 2001, by which time he had suffered 3 strokes. He couldn't even speak, and he did a deal with the Sun newspaper, and his the boy, who was by then 26 or 27, and was Raymunda's son, who he brought up, was able to forge a deal with the Murdoch press, and he came back on Rupert Murdoch's private jet, landing at Heathrow in 2001, and then went straight to Belmarsh prison after he was rearrested, where he spent another 8 years before being released on grounds that he was about to die anyway. And he and the Algerian bomber al-Megrahi were released on the same day on the basis that they both had cancer and they were only going to live a few more weeks. And actually, Biggs outlived al-Megrahi. Al-Megrahi lived for 2.5 more years back in Libya, and Ronnie Biggs lived for 4.5 more years in a care home in North London.
Extraordinary.
Stuck in the craw, of course, is that al-Megrahi, when he did eventually die, was given some sort of hero send-off. I distinctly remember the scenes from that. That was most disturbing. But anyway,
he was. You're absolutely right there. He had prostate cancer quite badly. There is a distinct view that he was the wrong person, that they'd actually jailed somebody. I'm not saying he was totally innocent, but it wasn't the person who planted the bomb in the plane. And I know a number of the relatives of the poor people who went down on the plane are still convinced that the right people haven't been convicted of that particular crime.
I remember, Colin, I was in a meeting some years ago, and we were talking about, luck and lucky charms, and, do you have any, just casual chit chat before we got into the main meeting. It was a corporate meeting about something around the boardroom table. And a fellow opposite me said, I always carry this. Opened up his briefcase and brought out a piece of paper that was clearly an airline ticket. And I said, oh, what's that? He was booked on the Lockerbie flight, and he got stuck in traffic. So listen to this, Phil. He showed me the ticket. You could see the number, the flight number, the whole thing. He said, I got stuck in traffic, and I missed my flight. And at the time, I was furious. Yeah. And he said, I keep this as a memento of how incredibly lucky, and whoever was looking after me that day, that I wasn't on that plane. I got goosebumps. I mean, it was just the weirdest moment to just be looking at the airline ticket for the Lockerbie flight. It was, even now, it makes me shiver.
I had a wonderful neighbor called Wing Commander Tim Vigers, who ended up being a leading light in the world of horse racing, but he'd been a pilot during the war. He'd somehow survived the Battle of Britain, and he was out in Singapore in 1942 helping out. He'd already used up 8 of his 9 lives. He was about to jump on a seaplane who was going to go take the very last people from Singapore to Australia before the Japanese finally invaded Singapore. And he eventually gave up his seat to some girl he thought had a greater need to go back. And I think she may have even been pregnant. And of course, that plane fell out of the sky and everybody was killed. And he literally had 9 lives and wrote a very interesting book about it. Tim Vigers, he's no longer with us, sadly, but that's another example. And these happen quite often, don't they? I'm reading a fascinating book at the moment about the Malaysian aircraft which went missing in 2013. And there were 5 people who failed to show up, even though their luggage was on the plane. So there's a lot of conspiracy theories about what happened to that aircraft. It's still unsolved, of course.
It is
but
unsolved.
There were 5 people who failed to take up their seats on that aircraft.
Colin, I wonder if I could broaden the conversation a bit, because it's a pleasure to have you, and but it's this. With social media, the pressure that puts you're from what I would call the golden age of journalism, if I may be so bold. We didn't have social media. Everybody wasn't a freaking expert. We didn't have to listen to Doreen, the hairdresser from Stoke-on-Trent, who apparently her medical knowledge is equal, if not better, to people who've studied for 30 years as doctors and scientists. How do you think, number one, social media has affected the press? And 2, are those days completely gone now?
Well, social media has transformed the press, not necessarily for the better, unfortunately. I'll just give you a little example of the pressure I was under in Rio in 1974. You placed a call to the office in London from Rio, and you'd have to sit by the telephone for up to 4 hours for the connection to be made. And it's extraordinary to think of it in this context. We'd actually landed a man on the moon 4.5 years earlier, and we could get communications from the moon, but you couldn't get from a telephone call from Rio to London. Quite extraordinary if you think about it. And that added an extra dimension of pressure to the big story. But I think journalists today are under almost more pressure. I mean, first of all, they get slagged off on the media all the time. I mean, I know people like Piers Morgan shrug it off, but he must feel pressure all the time. He gets a lot of criticism, I know, on social media. I'm a tiny little at Colin Mackenzie in the social media. In fact, I'm only really doing it now because at the behest of my daughters. Now I've got a website and this and that and the other, and I've had some lovely reaction to my book. So I haven't really ever faced the sort of trolling, but I'm so interested to see that all these sportsmen are using this weekend to ban social media, because it's getting, even in my own little world of horse racing, which I covered for the last 25 years of my Fleet Street career, jockeys now, if they lose a race by a nose or lose it by a neck, they get the most terrible personal criticisms on social media. When they're by and large, I'm sure, doing their level best to win.
I didn't even know that.
And I think it puts an enormous pressure on people now.
But the problem is, I think, is that people are too easily accessible. If you look at something like social media, years gone by, one would have had to have signed up to some sort of special not catalog, also a directory. That's what I'm thinking of. Special directory. If we want to get anywhere near famous people, you would have to sign up to some specialist directory that you'd have to pay a great deal of money for to show how serious you were about having access to said directory. You would then have to go through their agents. You would never go directly to them. And what would happen is, obviously, the agents would technically take up all of the abuse. They'd filter out all of the rubbish, I suppose. Now on social media, because most of these individuals have their own direct accounts, people are one step away from speaking to someone directly, no matter who they are. And they think that because of being social media, they can hide behind the proverbial keyboard. They're the keyboard warriors, as they're so called. And it's just ridiculous. I don't understand. I honestly believe, and this is rich coming from me because I'm on social media, Men's Radio is on social media, Russ, I know you are, Colin, you are. But I believe that the only thing we're ever going to do to get around this nonsense is to come up with some sort of pact, if you will, that anyone who is self-respecting actually steps away from social media, doesn't use it, period. That's it. Because then you're only left with the trash on there. It's as very simple as that. If you
well, Phil, how would we run and the team operate from men's radio station and women's radio station? We'd obviously close that day. We'd close down. That would be the end of it.
No,
but life did exist before social media. I mean, I'll give you a couple of little examples which I write about in the book. I mean, my very first week on the Daily Express, straight out of Greenhorn, straight out of Oxford, I got offered a job on the Express and the Mail, turned down by 15 provincial papers because they wanted kids straight out of school rather than graduates. And I was asked to go and ring around a few oldie Tonys to find out what the first day of school at Eton was like in their childhood. And I just pinched one name out of the ether, Harold Macmillan, and he'd ceased being Prime Minister about 9 months before, and he was back being the chairman of his publishing company, Macmillan's. I thought, I'll take a chance. I'll ring Macmillan's and see if I can get through. I've sort of the innocence of youth, I suppose. Anyway, you won't believe it. I got through, and I thought, oh, I might meet the secretary. And this wonderfully patrician voice picked up the phone and said, yes. I said, Mr. Macmillan, yes.
No.
I'd love to know about your, this is Colin Mackenzie of the Daily. I'd love to know about your first day at Eton and what your reaction was when you were a 13-year-old. And he thought for a long time, and I thought he put the phone down. And he said, Mr. Mackenzie, I'd like you to know as a publisher that my reminiscences are copyright. And I thought, what a wonderful case that was. But you know, quite extraordinary. In 1964, you could actually get through to the ex-Prime Minister. Will you try ringing Gordon Brown or Tony Blair or John Major? They've got PR men, secretary. You couldn't begin to get through to them without proving your credentials. And that's the difference between then and now. And it was so wonderfully naive. I mean, I'll give you one other little story. I had a little tip-off that Field Marshal Lord Montgomery had decided to do the football pools. And he was so at a loss to know how to fill the football pools in and do the treble chance. Now, for those of you who are far too young to know, the treble chance was picking out 8 draws in the 4 divisions of football. And if you picked out 8 draws and it was correct, you'd win 70 or 80,000 pounds, which was a fortune in 1964. Anyway, it sounded an extraordinary story. And he'd apparently rung the boss of Littlewoods, Mr. Moores, up in Liverpool and said, I can't work out how to do this. Would you kindly send your best lieutenant down to my house in Hampshire and teach me how to do the football pools? I mean, this is just the most wonderful story. Here's the man who led D-Day and the Allied forces through Europe and couldn't manage to work out how to do the football pools. I was then told by my immediate editor, he said, you've got to be very careful with Monty. He will answer the phone, but you've got to get all the details into one question because he'll put the phone down on the internet. So I spent time working out what to say, and I got through to him. I could hear his voice on the other end. I took about 10 minutes to ask this question with every conceivable detail I could work out in the question. And all he said was, quite right, with his speech impediment. I knew it was him because he couldn't say his R's like Jonathan Ross. And of course, as I'd put everything in the question, I was able to write this extraordinarily funny story.
Good
But
Lord.
that's you could do in 1964. You can't get hold of these people today.
Colin, I need to ask a small favour. I'm sorry to do this live on air, but as it stands, we're sort of slowly but surely seeing you disappear from view. So if you sit back, we can hear you. There we go. That's nice. We can see your face now. Lovely. We can hear you
I'll get rid
perfectly.
of my glasses. You can get me in all my glory.
There we go. Look at that. Perfect. Just sit back, relax, and enjoy yourself. We want to see
Colin,
you.
I've got to read this story out from one of our listeners, Sue Cressman. We were talking about luck, and you were talking about the Malaysian flight and Lockerbie, etc. This is extraordinary. I have an old friend who was on the ground on the motorway going to Scotland who survived the Lockerbie planes. It came down. Both cars in front and behind were hit, and the drivers died. all of his seats, other than the driver's seat, were on fire. He managed to get out of the car, but was injured because he stepped into aircraft fuel that was still burning. Amazingly, he's still alive and well. Wow.
That's an extraordinary story.
Grief.
And actually, there will be a big anniversary, I'm sure, coming up soon. Was it 86? I can't remember when the actual Lockerbie.
I remember I was in my
And
car going
it
to
was about
work.
86, I think. There's bound to be a big anniversary, and I imagine that person will be in demand because that's an extraordinary survival story.
Now, I want to get on to something else.
1988, apparently.
When was
Beg
it?
pardon?
December 1988, apparently.
Oh, right.
Wow.
Right, that's
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
So, Colin, one of the things as we get older in life, and Phil's going to go, but is watching your kids and people's kids do great things. For example, it was the Oscars last Sunday, and to my utter amazement, one of my oldest friend's kids just won an Oscar. And I remember this little kid as a tiny tot, and now he produced an award-winning film, and there he is in Hollywood. And I just remember this little kid. You have produced 3 extraordinary daughters. You must be very proud.
Well, I am. I'm sure their mother might think she's even prouder than I am. But no, I have. And good luck with trying to get number 3 on your radio show.
Oh, I'm
she's a bit
determined.
shy. Tara, she's a little bit shy, very talented interior designer. I think Boris should have used her and he'd have saved 50 grand of the 58 grand he owes.
If you don't mind me saying, though, that your other daughter, Kate, merciful heavens, Russ and I were most educated after her appearance.
Yeah, she was
Kate,
great.
yes.
Yes.
Well, Kate's, I have no idea where she's got it from, except her mother is a psychoanalyst. So I think a lot of it comes through her. She's got much more imagination than I have, and she's much more tolerant of everybody than I am. So she probably owes that to her lovely mother. My actress daughter, Georgia, probably owes a bit to my side of the family because we are a bit excessive. And my mother was a script writer and an actress in her younger days. So it's probably skipped a generation and gone to Georgia.
Am I going, forgive me, because we do have so many guests and I have a head like a pizza, but the name Hazel Adair came up.
Yeah, that's my mother. That was my
That's
mother.
your mum.
Yeah, that was my mother.
God.
She I think you may recall some of the soaps she wrote.
Yeah, Emergency Ward 10.
She
Crossroads.
did Emergency Ward 10, Crossroads, Compact, and lots of others. Sixpenny Corner was the very, very first soap on ITV on the opening day of 1955. I'm afraid I'm not exactly a soap fan because I was forced to watch Crossroads scenery falling down too many times. I rather got cured of watching soaps.
So that was your mum, of course. Oh wow, that is quite extraordinary. And of course, Georgia is in Unforgotten.
She is, yes. And luckily, I'm pleased. I don't know if she told you this, but there is going to be another series, even though the lead character was killed off. Lovely Nicola Walker is a wonderful actress.
Spoiler alert. Yeah, Nicola Walker's no longer in.
She's no longer in it, but George's part is being enhanced in the next series, I gather. She plays the pathologist in it. Yeah. And I think you very kindly, because I watched her interview with you, you could hardly recognize her because she was made to look rather plain on screen.
She was.
She's very glamorous in real life, as you know.
Well, yeah, I was like, hang on a minute, that doesn't look like the sort of fairly dull, pedestrian pathologist. It's interesting because the woman who, everyone's going crazy about Line of Duty, which is the last episode on Sunday night, and of course the woman Patricia Carmichael, who everybody hates. And then when they talk to the actress, she's funny and charming and laughing, and you think, God, I'm such an idiot. Even at my age, you think she's really like that because she's playing a part.
It's called acting.
No. Chrissy Holt, the answer to your question is that Colin's mother was the great scriptwriter and pioneer Hazel Adair. So she wasn't in Crossroads. That was Joe Good.
No, she wrote it. She created and wrote it.
Yeah, that was it. What's the name of your book, Colin?
Pressing My Luck. I have to say I was originally going to call it There's an Awful Lot of Copy in Brazil, which is a play on the song, of course, Bob Hope, Bing Crosby's song. But I discovered that not even my daughters or anybody under 60 understood the notion of copy. It's an old-fashioned Fleet Street term for when you write your stories, of course.
Yeah.
So I was talked out of it in the end. And pressing my luck is a play on pressing, and me having had a lucky career and being involved, of course, luckily in horse racing.
Now, that's curious that you say that you think there was luck involved, because I would just sort of call it really astute and very efficient journalism, frankly.
Well, I like to think I worked quite hard, but trust me, when you get good stories, a lot of luck is involved in the sourcing of the story. And of course, before the internet and before Twitter and all these other things, you had to either wait for stories to come into the office or source them yourself. I mean, I'll give you another little example of it's only a small gossipy story, but it was quite a riveting story at the time, and ended up with being discussed in the House of Commons. But when I was still young, I was only 24. I met this American girl at a party in London, and she said she was staying in the Tower of London. I said, "What do you mean you're staying in the Tower of London?" "Oh," she said, "I and 5 friends answered this ad in the New York Times that you could have a room in the house in the Tower of London for a £5 a night in London." I said, "That cannot be true." She said, "Well, it is." Anyway, I filed it away for 24 hours, took her out the next night. And I said, "Look, I'll take you back home." She said, "Well, you can't come into the place, but you can come and see where I go in." And so I took her on the tube back to the Tower of London, and there she was. She walked straight in. I thought, this is extraordinary. Anyway, so the following day, I wrote a story about it. And
you insulted Her Majesty, and then you would have walked straight into the tower.
Anyway, I wrote a story about the fact that Sir Thomas Butler, who was the warden of the Tower of London, was letting it out as a B&B establishment. And this got picked up by some Labour MPs in the House of Commons, who I can't remember specifically who it was now, but somebody actually said, "It's only 10 minutes away from the Queen inviting people to B&B in Buckingham Palace." And it caused a complete furore. Well, again, that was pure luck that I happened to go out with this girl for a couple of nights and came across this story. But it made a fantastic story in the Express at the time.
Was it closed down? Was that whole B&B operation stopped?
Oh, it was. I mean, I don't know how he survived. He had to resign about 6 months later, but that was shut down. I mean, it was against all the rules, as you can imagine. I mean, to qualify to be in the Tower of London, you had to, be a relation of Anne Boleyn or somebody like that.
Yeah.
Which is where
have you ever, Colin?
Head.
Have you ever attended the key ceremony at night at the Tower of London?
No, I haven't.
Oh, I got invited 2-3 years ago, and it's been uninterrupted for over 700 years, including all the world wars. Everything is the changing of the keys at night when they do this official locking up thing. It's all very formal. It was incredible to watch.
Really?
Incredible. And so much so that one night, and because, as I said, it's every single night for over 700 years, and one night the Germans dropped a bomb and it exploded within the grounds of the Tower of London, and and being the Beefeaters, who were just made of extraordinary stuff, much like yourself, they got up, brushed themselves down, adjusted their hat, and continued the ceremony.
I think it was wonderful. No, I haven't seen that. I have been inside Buckingham Palace. I had in the good old days, the press were invited to some of the Buckingham Palace garden parties, just to sort of cover the event. And I've done 2 or 3 of those and sniffed around Buckingham Palace. And in fact, relatively recently, I did get in touch. Do you remember the man who invaded Buckingham Palace and sat on the Queen's bed?
Yes.
What was his name? Not Fallon. Can't think of his name now. Anyway, I did get hold of this chap, and we were going to do a documentary together in my
Michael Fagan.
Michael Fagan, that's right.
That was it. Michael
Fagan. Sadly, he's still with us, but he is a little mentally challenged, and he pulled out of the project at the last minute, and cost me rather a lot of money, if you want to know.
Oh. Oh, that's a shame.
So I wasn't
Now,
very happy with Mr. Fagan.
No, well, I don't suppose the Queen was terribly happy to wake up and find him
No.
sitting on the edge of the bed.
No, he was
Lapse
fairly
of-
harmless as it turned out, but she wasn't to know that.
No, precisely so. And it's the same as, it's kind of a different way. George Harrison, when he was attacked in his own home, that was
Exactly.
absolutely right. Oh yes, it was Michael Fagan. Absolutely right. Colin, thank you so much. We could talk to you for hours, absolute hours. Right, tell us how we can get hold of your book. Plug it away. Go on.
Right. Well, it's very kind. It's a modest $9.99, and it's available through Amazon. Published by, oh God, I've forgotten the girl's name now. I got a New Zealand.
Can we see the cover while you're there?
There we are.
See the cover?
Pressing
There
my
we
luck.
Look at that.
That's
That
got the
is.
big story.
What a great
behind it.
cover!
And I've had some lovely reviews, bless them, from some old colleagues, well, people I didn't even know, including Roger Alton, who was editor of The Observer. He gave me a lovely review in the mail. Yes, $9.99 straight from Amazon. Rebel Magic Books published it. And it's freely available. And happily still being sold 3 or 4 months on from publication date. The one beauty about Amazon, which I hadn't quite taken on board before, because I have written a couple of other books, is that you can update the thing. And I've had 10 really nice reviews in newspapers and magazines, and they're now in the latest. If you buy the book tomorrow, you'll get all the reviews as well.
It's interesting because it's print on demand, isn't it? With Amazon,
It is. It's print on demand.
I know from my own
About
experience.
25
So
or 50,
it gives you fantastic.
I discovered that the index wasn't quite right when it first came out, and we were able to alter that within a couple of days. It was brilliant.
It gives you fabulous flexibility. Please give our regards to your daughters, your extraordinary family. Congratulations on the book. Thank you for finding time to talk to Phil and myself. It is that you are one of the guests that we would, if we had like the magic dinner party, right? You would be there, because those anecdotes I absolutely adore them. Absolutely.
I fear though that there might not be much food, because for me around I might eat all of it. But
well, of course you would. Yeah, eat before you come. Colin, thank you so much.
I need to go to that. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, absolute pleasure. Okay.
Keep going. Goodbye.
Oh, what a great guy.
You're in the presence of
what a guy.
Seriously. Do you know when you just feel like you've met greatness?
Yeah.
The only way I can describe it.
Just terrific man.